Picture this. It's July 4th, 1776, but there are no fireworks lighting up the American sky. No parades marching down Main Street. No barbecues in backyards celebrating independence. Instead, British flags still wave from every government building, and King George III's portrait hangs in what we know today as the White House. This isn't some dystopian fantasy. For most of the Revolutionary War, this outcome seemed not just possible, but probable. The Continental Army was outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly on the verge of collapse. George Washington himself nearly gave up multiple times. So what if history had taken just one small turn? What if a single battle had gone differently, or a crucial alliance had never formed? Today, we're diving into one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if America had lost the Revolutionary War? The answer will change everything you think you know about the world we live in today. Let's start with a truth that might surprise you. The American Revolution was never supposed to succeed. When you really look at the numbers, it seems almost impossible that it did. Britain in 1775 was the world's dominant superpower. They had the most powerful navy on Earth, controlling the seas from the Caribbean to India. Their army was professional, well-trained, and battle-tested from decades of European warfare. They had unlimited resources flowing in from their global empire, and they had money, lots of it. The American colonies, on the other hand, they had barely 2 million people, most of whom were farmers with no military training. They had no navy to speak of, no manufacturing base for weapons, and no unified government. When the Continental Congress tried to raise money, they had to essentially print it out of thin air, creating currency that became so worthless it gave birth to the phrase, "not worth a continental." But here's where it gets really interesting. The colonists almost didn't rebel at all. In 1774, just 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, most Americans still considered themselves proud British subjects. They weren't looking for independence. They just wanted fair representation in Parliament. The Boston Tea Party wasn't about freedom. It was about taxes. The colonists were essentially saying, "We want to be better Britons, not Americans." So what changed? A single pamphlet. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published in January 1776, and it spread through the colonies like wildfire. In just 3 months, it sold 100,000 copies, in a population of only 2 million. That's like a book selling 16 million copies in today's America in just 3 months. Paine didn't just argue against British rule. He made the radical case that kings and monarchy itself were unnatural. But even then, the decision for independence was incredibly close. When the Continental Congress voted on July 2nd, 1776, several colonies were still hesitant. If just a few key delegates had changed their minds, there might never have been a Declaration of Independence at all. And once the war began, well, that's when things got really desperate. If you think the Revolutionary War was a steady march toward American victory, think again. There were at least a dozen moments when the entire cause nearly collapsed, and the colonists came within inches of surrendering. Let's start with August 27th, 1776, the Battle of Long Island. Washington had just 19,000 troops defending New York City against 32,000 British and Hessian soldiers. It was a massacre. In a single day, the Americans lost over 1,000 men, while the British lost fewer than 400. Washington's army was trapped on Brooklyn Heights, with the East River behind them and the most powerful army in the world in front of them. This is where history balanced on a knife's edge. If British General William Howe had pressed his attack that day, He could have captured Washington and most of the Continental Army in one decisive blow. The war would have been over before it really began. Instead, Howe hesitated, giving Washington the night he needed to execute one of the most brilliant retreats in military history. But even that near miracle couldn't save the Continental Army for long. By December 1776, Washington was down to just 2,400 men, and their enlistments were set to expire at midnight on New Year's Eve. The cause was literally days away from collapse. Thomas Paine, the same man who had inspired the revolution with common sense, now wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country." He wasn't being poetic. He was describing reality. Soldiers were deserting in droves. Entire regiments simply walked away. Washington knew he had to do something desperate, or the war would end not with a bang, but with a whimper. That something was the famous crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776. But here's what most people don't know about this iconic moment. It almost didn't happen. The weather was so brutal that 2 of Washington's 3 crossing points had to be abandoned. Ice chunks the size of dining tables were flowing down the Delaware River. Several soldiers didn't even have shoes. Their feet left bloody trails in the snow. The password for the night was victory or death, because those were literally the only 2 options left. When they reached Trenton, they found the Hessian garrison hung over from Christmas celebrations. The surprise was complete. But what if the weather had been just a little worse? What if the Hessians had posted better guards? What if Washington had decided the risk was too great? The victory at Trenton bought Washington a few more months, but the fundamental problems remained. The Continental Army was always on the verge of starvation, always short of supplies, always one battle away from dissolution. During the winter at Valley Forge, soldiers literally ate their shoes to stay alive. Some left trails of blood in the snow from their bare feet. Joseph Plum Martin, a Continental soldier, wrote in his diary, "We were now in a truly forlorn condition. No clothing, no provisions, no money." This wasn't just one bad winter. It was the state of the American cause for most of the war. And then came the moment when even George Washington nearly gave up. The year 1780 was the darkest hour of the Revolutionary War, and it pushed George Washington to the absolute breaking point. This is the part of the story that doesn't make it into most history textbooks, because it reveals just how close America came to simply giving up. In May 1780, the British captured Charleston, South Carolina, along with 5,000 Continental soldiers, the largest surrender of American forces in the entire war. It was a devastating blow that opened up the entire South to British conquest. But that was just the beginning of Washington's nightmare year. 3 months later came news that would have broken a lesser man. Benedict Arnold, one of Washington's most trusted generals and the hero of Saratoga, had secretly negotiated to surrender West Point, the key fortress controlling the Hudson River, to the British. Arnold's betrayal wasn't just military, it was personal. Washington had defended Arnold against his critics, had trusted him with the most crucial command in America. When the plot was discovered, Washington reportedly stood in stunned silence for several minutes. His aide-de-camp later wrote that he had never seen the general so shaken. If Arnold had succeeded, the British would have controlled the Hudson River, effectively cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. The war would have been over. But here's the detail that really shows how desperate things had become. Washington seriously considered stepping down as commander-in-chief. In private letters to his closest advisors, he wrote about the impossibility of his situation. the Continental Army was down to fewer than 6,000 effective soldiers. They hadn't been paid in months. Many were literally naked, with no uniforms or shoes. Martha Washington later revealed that her husband had told her he was ready to retire to Mount Vernon and let Congress find someone else to lead this impossible cause. For several weeks in late 1780, America's greatest hero was on the verge of quitting. What changed his mind? A single piece of news that would transform everything. France was sending a fleet and 6,000 soldiers to support the American cause. But even this wasn't guaranteed to work. The French had their own reasons for helping America, and those reasons had nothing to do with liberty or independence. They wanted revenge against Britain for their defeat in the 7 Years' War. If the French had decided that supporting the Americans was too expensive, or if they had made a separate peace with Britain, the war would have ended in British victory. And there were moments when that nearly happened. In 1781, French Admiral de Grasse was supposed to sail from the Caribbean to Chesapeake Bay to trap British General Cornwallis at Yorktown. But de Grasse had orders from the French government to prioritize protecting French sugar islands in the Caribbean. Sugar was worth more to France than American independence. It was only because de Grasse chose to disobey his direct orders and sail north that the trap at Yorktown became possible. If he had followed his instructions, Cornwallis would have escaped by sea, and the war would have continued for years, possibly ending in British victory through American exhaustion. The surrender at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, seemed like the end of the war, but it almost wasn't. King George III wanted to continue fighting. He had fresh troops ready to sail from Britain. It was only because the British Parliament had grown war-weary and voted to end the conflict that peace negotiations began. Think about that. American independence came down to a vote in the British Parliament. If a few dozen members had voted differently, if King George had been more persuasive, the war could have continued with fresh British forces facing an exhausted and bankrupt Continental Army. So what would have happened if America had lost? What would our world look like today if George Washington had surrendered at Valley Forge? Or if Benedict Arnold had succeeded in his treason? Or if the French had never intervened? The implications are staggering, and they go far beyond just America remaining British. First, let's talk about what would have happened to the revolutionary leaders. In 1776, when the delegates signed the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin famously said, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." He wasn't joking. By declaring independence, every signer had committed high treason against the crown, punishable by death. If the Americans had lost, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and dozens of other founding fathers would likely have been executed. The British had already made examples of rebels in other parts of their empire. In 1798, they hanged the leaders of the Irish Rebellion. In 1857, they executed Indian rebels after the Sepoy Mutiny. There's no reason to think American rebels would have been treated differently, but the executions would have been just the beginning. The British would have implemented what they called pacification policies, massive deportations of rebel sympathizers to distant parts of the entire families would have been shipped to Canada, Australia, or India. The population of what we call New England would have been scattered across the globe. The economic consequences would have been immediate and severe. The British would have imposed crushing taxes to pay for the cost of the war. They would have stationed permanent garrisons in every major city, turning places like Boston and Philadelphia into military camps. Trade would have been strictly controlled. with all manufacturing kept in Britain to benefit the mother country. But here's where it gets really interesting. Without American independence, the French Revolution might never have happened. France's support for the American Revolution had bankrupted the French government. The debts from the American War were a major factor in the financial crisis that led to the calling of the Estates General in 1789, which triggered the French Revolution. Without those debts, King Louis XVI might have avoided the financial crisis that cost him his throne and his head. No French Revolution would have meant no Napoleon Bonaparte. Think about what that would have changed. No Napoleonic Wars, no Louisiana Purchase, no spread of democratic ideals across Europe. The map of Europe today would be completely different. And what about slavery? This is where the alternate history gets really dark. The British had begun to turn against slavery by the 1780s. The Somerset Case of 1772 had effectively ended slavery in England itself. British abolitionists like William Wilberforce were gaining influence. If America had remained British, there's a good chance slavery would have been gradually abolished throughout the empire decades earlier than it actually was. But here's the twist. Without American independence, there would have been no Northwest Ordinance, no Missouri Compromise, no gradual restriction of slavery's expansion. The entire interior of North America might have developed as slave territory under British rule, creating a massive plantation economy from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Or consider technology and innovation. The American patent system, established in 1790, created the world's first true innovation economy. Men like Eli Whitney, Samuel Morse, and Thomas Edison built their empires on American patent law. Without American independence, would the Industrial Revolution have developed the same way? Would we have had the telegraph, the telephone, the light bulb when we did? The answer is probably no. British patent law favored established interests over individual inventors. The great wave of American innovation that drove the 19th and 20th centuries might never have happened. And then there's the question of westward expansion. The British had issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was one of the grievances that led to the Revolution. If America had remained British, the entire American West might have remained Native American territory for generations longer. Imagine if the Great Plains had never been settled, if California had remained a Spanish colony, if the Pacific Northwest had stayed in Russian hands. The United States, as we know it, simply wouldn't exist. The consequences of an American defeat would have echoed through every major event in world history for the next 250 years. Let's trace just a few of these ripples and see how different our world might have been. Without American independence, there would have been no Constitution, no Bill of Rights, no example of a successful democratic republic in the modern world. The ideas of popular sovereignty and individual rights that America pioneered would have remained theoretical concepts discussed in European salons rather than practical realities. This means the wave of democratic revolutions that swept across Europe and Latin America in the 19th century might never have happened. Simon Bolivar, who liberated much of South America, explicitly cited the American example as his inspiration. Without that example, Spanish and Portuguese colonies might have remained under European control for centuries longer. Consider the American Civil War. If America had remained British, the question of slavery would have been decided in London, not Washington. The British abolished slavery throughout their empire in 1833. Would this have prevented the massive bloodshed of the American Civil War? Or would it have caused an even larger rebellion by Southern planters who refused to give up their human property? The implications for the 20th century are even more staggering. Without the United States as an independent nation, both World War I and World War II would have unfolded completely differently. In World War I, British North America might have contributed troops and resources, but nothing like the decisive intervention that the United States provided in 1917 to 1918. Without fresh American troops breaking the stalemate on the Western Front, the war might have ended in a negotiated peace rather than Allied victory. Kaiser Wilhelm II might have remained on the German throne. The Russian Revolution might have been crushed with German support. But it's World War II where the changes become truly mind-boggling. Without an independent United States, there would have been no Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese would have had no reason to attack British North America. There would have been no American industrial base pumping out tanks, planes, and ships for the Allies. Most critically, there would have been no Manhattan Project as we know it. The atomic bomb was developed primarily by American scientists using American resources in American laboratories. Without American independence, would the bomb have been invented at all? And if it had been, would it have been British scientists working for the Crown rather than American scientists working for democracy? Imagine if Nazi Germany had developed nuclear weapons first, with no American atomic program to counter it. The outcome of World War II might have been very different indeed. Even the Cold War would have been impossible without American independence. The ideological conflict between capitalism and communism was really a conflict between American-style democracy and Soviet-style authoritarianism. Without America as a separate nation, the Soviet Union would have faced only the European colonial powers, Britain, France, and others who were already declining by 1945. The space race, the civil rights movement, the computer revolution. None of these would have happened the same way without American independence. Silicon Valley exists because of American venture capital, American universities, and American immigration policies. The Internet was created by American defense researchers. The personal computer revolution was led by American entrepreneurs. Take away American independence, and you take away most of the technological and social innovations that define the modern world. But perhaps the most profound difference would have been in the realm of ideas. America didn't just achieve political independence in 1783. It proved that ordinary people could govern themselves without kings, nobles, or established churches. That idea spread around the world, inspiring democratic movements from France to Haiti to India. Without that example, would democracy have ever become the dominant form of government we know today? Or would we still be living in a world of empires and monarchies, where people were subjects rather than citizens? So what would 2025 look like in a world where America had lost the Revolutionary War? The differences would be so fundamental that we can barely imagine them. Politically, North America might still be divided into British provinces, each governed by appointed officials reporting to London. Instead of Washington, D.C., the capital of British North America might be in Toronto or Montreal. The maple leaf flag would fly from sea to shining sea, and God Save the King would be the national anthem. But would it really be that simple? History suggests that even if the revolution had failed, the desire for self-governance wouldn't have disappeared entirely. We might have seen a gradual evolution toward independence, similar to what happened in Canada, Australia, and India. British North America might have achieved dominion status by the 1860s and full independence by the 1920s. but as a constitutional monarchy, not a republic. Economically, North America would likely be far less developed than it is today. The entrepreneurial spirit that drove American innovation was partly a product of American political freedom. Without the Constitution's protection of property rights, without the American patent system, without the American tradition of individual opportunity, the continent's vast resources might have remained underdeveloped for decades longer. The great American cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, might be modest provincial towns. The American West might still be sparsely populated wilderness. California might have remained Mexican, or become Russian, or been divided among European powers. Culturally, we wouldn't have Hollywood movies spreading American values around the world. We wouldn't have jazz music, born in the unique mixing pot of American slavery and freedom. We wouldn't have the Statue of Liberty, because France wouldn't have given it to celebrate American democracy. We wouldn't have baseball, because it evolved from uniquely American folk games. The very concept of the American dream, the idea that anyone can make it in America regardless of their birth, wouldn't exist, because America wouldn't exist. And what about the rest of the world? Without American independence serving as an example, would the British Empire have evolved differently? Would slavery have ended sooner or later? Would democracy have spread to other continents? One thing seems certain. The world would be far more hierarchical, far more stratified by class and birth. The egalitarian ideals that America pioneered, however imperfectly, might never have taken root anywhere. We might be living in a world where most people still think of themselves as subjects rather than citizens, where opportunity is determined by bloodline rather than effort, where the idea of popular government seems as impossible today as it did to most people in 1775. But perhaps most haunting of all is this thought: we would never know what we were missing. In a world where the American experiment never happened, the ideas of equality and individual liberty might seem as foreign and impossible as they did to King George III when he first heard about the Declaration of Independence. As we've seen, the American Revolution succeeded by the narrowest of margins. A different decision by a French admiral, a successful betrayal by Benedict Arnold, a slightly worse storm during Washington's crossing of the Delaware. Any of these could have changed everything. The world we live in today, with its democratic governments, its individual freedoms, its entrepreneurial economy, its technological innovations, all of it traces back to those desperate men who crossed an icy river on Christmas night in 1776, not knowing if they would live to see dawn. History often seems inevitable when we look backward, but when we look closely at the details, we see how fragile our world really is. The America we know was never guaranteed. Democracy was never inevitable. Freedom was never assured. Every right we enjoy, every opportunity we have, every innovation that makes our lives better, it all hangs on a thread that nearly broke more than 2 centuries ago. The next time you see an American flag, or vote in an election, or start your own business, remember, it almost never happened at all. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about the American Revolution isn't that it succeeded. It's that we live in the one timeline where it did. Out of countless possible futures, we inhabit the one where a few thousand desperate rebels changed the course of human history. What other threads of history are hanging by such slender margins today? What other impossible dreams might reshape our future? Only time will tell. But if the American Revolution teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the most unlikely outcomes become inevitable. And sometimes the fate of the world comes down to a single decision made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The story of America is the story of what happens when people refuse to accept that change is impossible. It's a reminder that history isn't written by fate, but by the choices we make when everything seems lost. What impossible thing will you choose to make possible?